Teaching young learners. How first and second languages are learned. First language acquisition. Most children acquire language quickly and easily, just by hearing it and using it. It happens automatically, through their normal interaction with their parents, caretakers, and other children. We know that children acquire their first language, or L1, simply by hearing it and using it. The child spends a long time listening before he or she begins to speak. We know that children create the language system in their minds, and they simplify rules. And we also know that children acquire language in stages. What are the features of the L1 environment? What are the main features of the first language learning environment? And what features can you identify which support children in the development of their mother tongue? For example, much of the language that children encounter is simplified to the level of understanding of the child. Parents use language that uses simple words and structures. Pause the video and make a note of your ideas. And when you're ready, click to continue. Here are some of the main characteristics of the learning environment which support language development. We saw before that much of the language is simplified to the level of understanding of the child. Parents use language that has simple words and structures. The language is not sequenced by grammar or vocabulary. There's no textbook to follow. There is lots of repetition, and all of the language is spoken in the context of the real world, about things that are important to the child then and there. And the child has many opportunities to hear and use the language to communicate to parents, caretakers, and other children. First language strategies. So, what innate strategies does the child use to learn his or her first language? For example, children use their natural interests to help them understand and learn to communicate. Think about this, and pause the video for a moment to make a note of your ideas. Then click to continue. First language strategies. Here are some of the main characteristics that children incorporate into their language that support their language development. First, the child uses his interests to help him learn. He's unlikely to want to talk about things that are not important at the moment. Secondly, the child naturally wants to call an object by its name, because these are the objects that he or she uses to play, eat, or interact with. For example, car, doggy, spoon. The children naturally wants to take part in life around him or her, using the new language. This way he or she can express needs and wants. For example, Lily hungry. The child immediately uses the language, and success in communication builds confidence. If a child says Lily hungry and food appears, she knows she's been successful. Typical language skills for children aged 2 to 6. What can a 2 to 3-year-old child typically do with language? How do they develop between 3 and 6 years old? Think carefully. You're going to make 4 lists, one for each age group. Here are some examples to get you started. 2 to 3 years old. The vocabulary consists mostly of nouns. 3 to 4 years old. The vocabulary increases to around 1,000 words, and there are more verbs. 4 to 5 years old. They're asking who, what, why, where, and what if questions. 5 to 6 years old. The vocabulary ranges between 1,500 words and 2,500. Pause the video for a moment and make notes. And when you're ready, click to continue. Then compare and update your lists. Okay, these are the typical language skills we expect from a 2 to 3-year-old. The vocabulary consists of nouns primarily, and they're starting to say plural words. They respond to simple directions, and they're using pronouns. They respond when they're called by name, and they're enjoying simple stories, rhymes, and songs. Children of this age enjoy looking at books. Typically, they're using 2 to 3 words in a sentence. They can point to their eyes, ears, and nose when asked, and they repeat words when they're spoken by somebody else. They can answer simple what questions, and the vocabulary expands up to about 500 active words. So what about 3 to 4-year-olds? Well, these are the typical language skills we would expect. At this age, the vocabulary increases to about 1,000 words and there are more verbs. They're talking in complete sentences now, between 3 and 5 words, and they understand location words, prepositions, such as over, under, on, and in. They enjoy repeating words and sounds over and over. In a sense, they like playing with language. And they begin to ask who, what, where, and why questions. They like listening to short stories, and they like familiar stories which are told without changes in words. They enjoy listening to simple rhymes, and they like to sing. They can identify common colours, red, blue, yellow, and green, and they enjoy telling simple stories from pictures or books. So what about 4 to 5-year-olds? Well, at this age they're beginning to develop their reading skills and they may be able to print their own name. They can ask who, what, why, where, and what if questions. They enjoy singing simple songs, rhymes, and nonsense words. They adapt language to the listener's level of understanding, and they're starting to speak in more complex sentences. By the age of 5 to 6, we can expect the vocabulary range to be between 1,500 and 2,500 words. They love to tell jokes that may not make much sense to adults. They like to talk and carry out elaborate conversations, and they speak with correct grammar at this age. Some children like to shock others by using forbidden words as well. Okay, that was a lot of information. So what do you remember? Well, let's briefly review some of that information. I'll give you a statement, and you decide which age group it refers to. 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, or 5 to 6. Are you ready? Starts to say plural words. This refers to 2 to 3-year-old children. Adapts language to the listener's level of understanding. This one's for 4 to 5-year-olds. Talks in complete sentences of 3 to 5 words. Again, this is 3 to 4 years old. Starts speaking in complex sentences. 4 to 5 years old. Speaks with correct grammar. 5 to 6 years old. Uses 2 to 3 word sentences. 2 to 3-year old. Vocabulary increases to about 1,000 words with more verbs. 3 to 4-year-olds. Similarities between L1 and L2 acquisition. Up till now, we've looked at a range of factors which relate to first language acquisition, and in some ways, learning a second or foreign language is similar. We've learned that most children acquire language quickly and easily simply by hearing it and using it. We've learned that it happens automatically through their normal interaction with their parents, caretakers, and other children. We've noted that there are features of the language parents and others use which support language acquisition. And we know that children are active in their own language development and they use innate strategies to direct their own learning. Pause for a moment. What similarities can you identify between the way children learn a first and second language? And make a list of your ideas. This is important because it helps us establish a framework for how we plan and deliver our classes. Think about it, and when you're ready, click to continue. While there are obvious differences between L1 and L2 language development, we can identify the following similarities. For both, there are certain stages and structures which are learned in a set order. Children may move more slowly or quickly through these stages, but they can't skip ahead. Another similarity. Making errors. Making errors is a part of learning. Learners need to make and test ideas about language. Examples of this is the way that they make errors with irregular verbs, such as eated, or plurals, such as foots. And learners can often understand more complex language than they're able to use. Their receptive capacity is greater than their productive. So what about the differences? Well, people generally, but children in particular, are hardwired to learn language. We actively want to communicate with and understand others. The brain builds an internal system of language through interaction with people and the world around us. This system is called interlanguage. A majority of people around the world are bilingual or trilingual, and there seems to be no limit to the number of languages that people could potentially learn. And although people learn languages at any age, there is some evidence to suggest that young children may have unique capabilities which drive language acquisition and therefore make it easier for them to master a second or third language in a more natural way. What differences can you identify between acquiring a first or second language? When we refer to a second language, we often mean a language used in a particular context other than home, and for us, this means the language classroom. So, one obvious difference is the context. For us, children will have far less access to the language outside of the walls of the class. They may only have limited contact, and this will affect the speed at which a child will develop their second language knowledge and skills. Make a note of other differences between the way a child will acquire a first and second or third language, and when you're ready, click to continue. Here are some of the most obvious differences. Did you get them all? Context of learning. Home and local environment versus school and teacher. This is a very obvious difference. Access to language. Children learning a second or third language are often within a data-poor environment. They don't have so much access to language that's comprehensible. And use of the language. They have fewer opportunities to interact in it. There are differences in motivation. What reason does a child have to want to use a second language? And the age of learning. Older children often study the language and can analyze it with reference to their mother tongue. However, this is different from acquisition. Here are some key concepts and terms that we use for talking about second language learning. Acquisition versus learning, interlanguage, L1 transfer and interference, affective factors, critical period. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail now. Acquisition versus learning. First language is acquired naturally and not through explicit teaching. In a way, we can define acquisition as simply picking up a language. A second language could be both learned through study and acquired implicitly through natural, meaningful communication. Interlanguage. This is the term that refers to the internal system of rules that the child builds within their own mind. Interlanguage is a dynamic system. It develops as the learner moves from a complete beginner to fluent language user, and it represents everything the child knows about the structure of a language. L1 transfer and interference. When a learner begins to learn a second or foreign language, they will understand it in relation to their first language. This means they will transfer and apply rules and concepts as they learn to understand and communicate. Transfer may be a cause of error in the second language. Affective factors. Internal and external factors have an impact on the learner's success in learning to communicate in a foreign language. Motivation, stress, and confidence matter. Attitudes towards the language and language learning can also affect the speed and quality of the learning. Critical period. People learn languages at any age, but there is some evidence that a combination of factors, including brain development, in early childhood, mean that this is the optimum time to begin learning a second language or foreign language. However, research also suggests that it's more about optimal conditions than a critical period. The importance of input and output. Our responsibility as teachers is to back up our classroom practice in relation to the research. We need to be sure about why we are doing what we do in the classroom and to use theory to make sure our teaching conforms to recognized best practice. Do you remember this from last week? This came from Rod Ellis, a leading ELT researcher. Principle 8. The opportunity to interact in the L2 is central to developing L2 proficiency. Ellis wrote, "While it is useful to consider the relative contributions of input and output to acquisition, it's also important to acknowledge that both co-occur in oral interaction, and that both computational and socio-cultural theories of L2 acquisition have viewed social interaction as the matrix in which acquisition takes place." And we've just seen that when the child is learning their first language, this is done in a naturalistic environment through interaction with parents, other children and caregivers. What are comprehensible input and output? These terms are fundamental to the way we introduce and practice language in the classroom. They are an attempt to bring some of the conditions of first language acquisition into the second language learning environment. Pause for a moment and try to define the characteristics of each one. Note down your ideas for the types of input in practice you can include in your teaching practice. And when you're ready, click to continue. So what is comprehensible input? Well, input refers to all the language that learners hear and see, and comprehensible means that it can be understood to a level of certainty. That's important, because learners can understand key points and guess meaning without understanding every word, using contextual cues and learning strategies. Comprehensible input is language that is within the child's zone of understanding, but it pushes them to understand, and they may not be able to produce the language without mediation from a teacher or a parent. And lastly, it's sufficiently adjusted to help learners acquire language naturally. This means that it uses more simple structures, here and now statements, more checking statements, and perhaps a more limited range of vocabulary as well. So how can you make sure you use comprehensible input in the classroom? Well, one way is to use as many different sources of language as possible, with the aim of providing authentic examples of real language in use. And while this may be graded, authenticity is important. After all, we're teaching children to communicate with others. Make sure that your own teacher talk is natural, graded, and relevant. We're going to look more at teacher talk in a future presentation. When you're planning, make sure that you give students lots of chances to interact and communicate. And use visual aids, such as images and objects, to help provide context. Children love stories, so make great use of narratives, not only in stories but in mini-dramas and short scenes as well. And don't only use single words. Make sure that children understand phrases and sentences. So what is comprehensible output? Well, this is the language produced by the learner in a given context. It's language which is understandable to other people in that context, and it's language which successfully communicates the learner's intention and message. It's generated through practicing language with their peers, or through talking with the teacher or a helper. And it's language which encourages learners to challenge themselves as they attempt to communicate. This will help them develop and improve as accurate and fluent language learners. So how can we make use of comprehensible output in the classroom? Well, the most obvious way that we've discussed several times is to provide the maximum amount of time for learners to use language in meaningful communication activities. Ask the learner for more information when they're speaking, or for the answer again. Encourage them to push themselves a little bit more. And don't accept single-word answers. It can help to repeat tasks with a new partner, or to do the same thing in a different way. When we talk, we have an audience, so you need to provide that for children. The audience can be you, or the other children, or the helper, or we can invent audiences by, for example, audio recordings or video, which can be shown to parents. Encourage learners to use new language, and provide them with the language they need to use during the lesson so that they can complete a task. This may be specific vocabulary, but it could be also process language. For example, the basic language that we use when we're doing an art and craft activity or when we're playing a game. We've covered a lot of ground already, and it's time now to take a pause and look at who some of the key practitioners are who've informed the way that we teach a second language to children. The first is Jean Piaget. You may have heard of him. He lived in Switzerland from 1896 to 1980. Piaget's work on child development has had a strong impact on the way we teach younger learners. He studied how children interact with the world. He found that children develop in a series of stages, and they learn when they run into a problem and take action to solve it. For example, when faced with the concern, how do I get food to my mouth? A child's early solution is to use its fingers. A later solution is to use a spoon. Problems are solved through action, and later this action develops into thoughts. So, Piaget's belief is that development happens as a result of activity. Those two processes of development are what Piaget termed assimilation and accommodation, and they're very important. So let's pause for a moment and consider what they mean. Think about how the child solves the problem of how to get food to its mouth. How does that relate to assimilation and accommodation? Note down some ideas, and when you're ready, click to continue. Okay, let's clarify. It begins with the child having a mental framework. This is called a schema, and that schema is updated with new information. And the information is updated in two stages. The first, assimilation, involves the child solving the problem according to what they already know. Later, the change is an accommodation, and this is a change in the behaviour that adjusts to that new information. At this stage, the schema is updated. So take the example of a child. A child learns to recognise a cat. Later, the child sees a dog. At first, the child will think that the dog is another form of cat. They won't separate them into two distinct categories. That stage is assimilation. Later, when the child has accessed more data, seen more animals, for example, an accommodation takes place and the child sees that dogs and cats are separate things. At this stage, they've changed their behaviour and it's adjusted to the new information. Those two terms are important. They represent how we can identify the different stages at which our own learners are in terms of their own language development process, as well as their physical development. Stages of development. Piaget was the first to show that children think differently at different periods in their lives. He believed that all children go through 4 very distinct stages of development. We're going to investigate those stages in a little detail now. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. This takes place between birth and approximately 2 years old. Next comes the pre-operational stage, between 2 and 7 years old. Then, concrete operational stage, roughly from 7 to 11 years old. Finally, the formal operational stage, which takes place between 11 and adulthood. Pause for a moment. Think about the children you teach, your own children, or those of friends and family. What can you say about how their physical abilities, their cognitive skills and knowledge develop at the stages above? And make a note of your ideas. We're going to look in turn at each one. When you're ready, click to continue. The sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years old. At this stage, the child experiences the world through movement and rich sensory data. They don't have words to think with at first, and they can only see things from their own viewpoint. From approximately 2 years old, the child enters the pre-operational stage. It becomes possible to have a conversation with the child, and they learn a huge number of words, and they use the concept of numbers. Without direct teaching, children learn basic grammar. In English, for example, a child will pick up the idea that the past tense of a regular verb is formed by adding ed. The child at first uses this rule for all verbs. They can correctly say, "I looked for a shoe," but they also say the girl hitted me or the dog bited him. They're still not able to think logically, and they believe, for example, that what you can see in a picture, anyone else can see too. They often play beside each other, it's called parallel play, without actually interacting, and unless perhaps one child starts playing with the other's toy. They can group certain things into categories and put objects into order, and they begin to develop a form of logical reasoning and thinking. From around the age of 7, the child enters the concrete operational stage, and it's at this stage that they begin to deal with more abstract concepts such as numbers, relationships, and how to reason. And they can group certain things into categories and put objects into order, for example, by size or number. They start to develop that logical thinking and reasoning. At this age, the child can understand that, for example, because 3 plus 4 equals 7, then 7 minus 4 must equal 3. In class, logical reasoning is supported by giving children things, puzzles for example, that they can manipulate. This type of cognitive challenge is very rewarding and pleasurable for young children. The final stage of development is called formal operational, and it takes place between adolescence and adulthood. They develop abstract thought and higher order cognitive skills, and they can reason logically, systematically, and hypothetically. They can understand meanings without the need for physical objects or images. In other words, they can imagine things that do not exist or that they've never experienced. Piaget is a leading light in the development of our methodology, and another is Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky lived in Russia from 1896 to 1934, and he was a Russian psychologist. He developed a theory of social interaction, and his work has had a profound influence on many areas of early years education. Some of his key beliefs were that social interaction plays an essential role in the development of a child's ability to think, and that language is a tool for relating to the environment and organizing information. He found that children move from private speech to social speech, and that talking aloud in social interaction helps them develop their thinking. Let's look at some other key principles from Vygotsky. Scaffolding. The child's development takes place in an environment mediated by adults. Adults explain the world to them, and adults structure the child's world. Parents will adjust their language in all kinds of ways which make meanings clear, to give feedback and praise, and generally encourage the child to talk. We refer to this kind of support as scaffolding, and a child's caretakers, parents and other adults, scaffold all areas of a child's development. So, scaffolding means giving the learner hints or strategies for problem solving in order to help them with the task in the future. Because with help, children can often do things that they can't do on their own. Adults can encourage the child's learning by talking while playing, reading stories, and asking questions. We noted that with help, children can often do things that they can't do on their own, and that help is referred to as scaffolding. At the beginning of learning something, the child needs a strong level of scaffolding, which the parent gradually reduces as the child is able to stand on its own 2 feet. There is a gap between what the child can do with adult help and what they can confidently do by themselves. We previously looked at the example of a child learning to use a spoon to get food to its mouth. With the guiding hand of a parent, the child can be successful. Over time, they don't need so much help and they can successfully bring the food to their mouth using the spoon all by themselves. And Vygotsky calls this area the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. and it has important implications for teaching. In a class, different children will be able to use help from the teacher in different ways. For example, if they're learning the question, "Do you like swimming?" some children may be able to use the pattern with other words they've learned. For example, "Do you like ice cream?" Some may just be able to repeat the sentence but not adapt it in any way. And some will have trouble understanding and repeating it accurately. They are all in different places within the zone of proximal development. The teacher needs to match the amount of help or scaffolding they provide to where they assume the child is in terms of their own independence. This means knowing your learners well. It means providing lots of very focused mediation to help each child achieve what they need to achieve. This could be, for example, helping some child move the pencils slowly across the paper in order to write something, while a child next to them may be able to write confidently all by themselves. Summing up. In this input, you've explored some of the main theories which underpin the way we teach and plan. This knowledge is important because it helps us to plan and deliver lessons according to how children actually learn and develop. Here are some of the things we've looked at. First and second language acquisition. We looked at similarities and differences. We considered some features of the learning environment and the strategies that learners use and the typical development stages of language in the early years between 2 and 6. We looked at some key concepts and terms for talking about language development, and we understood the importance of comprehensible input and output in our classes. We took a brief look at 2 key practitioners and their theories. Those practitioners were Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. And we've taken some consideration on the implication of their theory in our own teaching practice. In the next input, you're going to use that information to find out more about how to create the optimal conditions for learning in your classroom. But before then, you'll meet with your group to discuss what you've learned in this section. So take some time, organize your notes and highlight any new theories, concepts and terms that you've learned. Are you confident about what they mean in terms of your teaching practice? Prepare any questions and comments that you want to raise in your group discussion. And can you relate what you've learned to your experience of teaching children? If you're currently teaching, pay attention to your learners in class and think about their stages of development, the language they use, and how they interact and learn during activities. Make a note of any insights that you want to share with your group. Look forward to seeing you next time.